Everybody, welcome to another edition of the Leadership Blend Live podcast with your host, Ricardo Rice, and my co-host,
Simone Cherie.
All right, again, I feel like we've been gone for 15 years, but we're back today. And today, I'm very excited. We have a very, he doesn't say so, but I'm going to say so, renowned attorney taking on major cases and making a lot of noise here in Atlanta that needs to be made. None other than Mr. Attorney Gerald Griggs. Glad to have you on today, sir. How's it going?
It's going great. I'm honored to be here on the platform, so looking forward to a robust conversation.
Absolutely. All right, so for those that don't know, tell them a little bit about you.
Well, I'm an Atlanta native, born and raised. I've been an attorney for about 16 years, practicing in the areas of civil rights, of course, social justice activism, and criminal defense. And just a native son of Atlanta that wants to see change, that grew up in the shadow of the civil rights movement and have been on the front lines of the social justice movement here in Atlanta.
All right, so Simone, there's a lot to talk about today. So what do we have on the rundown?
I think that we have so much that we want to dissect with you, and it will kind of overlap with the headlines and everything that's going on right now. But I do think we should spend a little bit of time talking more political, more high level. So let's talk about the Biden administration and how we feel about these first 100 days. And then I think after we do that, we can cover some Georgia news because the session wrapped over a month ago now. We're getting close to the end of the signing period right now with our governor, but he's been signing some bills, not signing all bills. We'll kind of see what he ends up completing, and then we can give a quick update about what we should expect. The standard time bill, side note, that you and I thought was ridiculous, but that you and I thought was so silly that actually passed into law.
Which one?
Things like that.
How about I say which
Georgia
one?
observing standard time only. So we'll cover political news, we'll cover federal, state, and then we'll get right into a whole bunch of the cases, and as well as your background as well. I think that'll be really helpful.
All right, so which one?
So I'll just start. I'll just say my own opinion in case it goes all downhill from there.
I'm trying to say,
as somebody who's I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Democratic voter traditionally. However, so maybe that's why I was pretty impressed with what I saw out of our president and out of our vice president. For one thing, it was void of nonsense. It was coherent. The sentences made sense. There was nothing that was very, nothing salacious, nothing racist, nothing extreme.
Basically, we didn't have the shock jock value that we normally would have, not knowing what's going to be said or how it's going to be said.
I thought that was a welcome change. You know, Twitter didn't turn a different color and explode because of something that our administrator said, our lead administrator said. So I was happy with that. I felt like, was there anything groundbreaking in terms of news? Not necessarily. I think that we've been talking plenty about what his administration's been doing. We've been talking a lot about the stimulus. We've been talking a lot about what's going on with COVID and the vaccines that are out. So I don't know if it was, I don't know if
groundbreaking.
I don't know if people are expecting groundbreaking, but I was happy for a change of weather, for nice mild weather. And I was pretty impressed with it overall.
I mean, impressed is cute. I think, and we've talked about this, I feel like we're in a season and a climate of actual change. So I don't know if I heard a lot of that. Like I heard a lot of rhetoric. I heard a lot of, like you said, niceties. And that's cute, but there's too much civil unrest to be normal. And I think when we use that term normalcy, has normalcy ever worked for black folk? Now, when I thought about it, I was like, has that ever worked for us to go back to what's normal and everybody kind of going back to their corners and kind of like, okay, well, that sounds good. I don't know if we're in that season. So it was cute. But honestly, it's what happened after that is really what set everybody off with Tim and Kamala saying what she said. And I just, when a black man stands up and says that he don't believe that the United States is racist,
now,
what is there to be
Tim
said?
Scott is a very respected senator and has been senator for a very long time. Now, and there's always a partisan alternative to an address, always.
I know.
And the tone is always different.
But when a black man stands up and says that,
I understand.
I think that's what hit differently for everybody. When a black man stands up and says that in the face of all that has happened in the last year, it's like, are you having a Twin Peaks experience? Like, where have you, well, I was about to say, where have you been? We know where you've been, pretty much nowhere. Where have you been to actually stand up and say that? And then for Kamala to come behind him and kind of not so much say the same thing, but kind of sit in the same space and try to walk the line. It's like, from two black people? Like, really? Is this?
Well, what I will say about Senator Scott, though, is that my distaste was that he did contradict himself.
That too.
In the past, he has said plenty of times that as long as he's been a sitting senator, he's been stopped by Capitol Police who are like, who are you and what are you doing here? And he's been profiled plenty of times himself, and he's shared those experiences, and I think he shared them as recently as last year in the wake of everything that was going on. So that is kind of nonsensical to me because it's the exact opposite of what he just said. But there are plenty of people who do feel that way. They don't always look like that.
I mean, we expect.
I'd love to know what you thought.
Oh, he's waiting. He got his look.
Well, you know, as a black man who's lived on this planet for 42 years in Georgia, I found it insulting. I respect Tim Scott as the only African-American senator on the other side of the aisle, but I need him to come to grips with reality. Systemic racism is very real in the United States. It's real in Georgia. It's real in South Carolina. And so as somebody that has family in South Carolina who were also displeased with the representation of their senator, I think he needs to reevaluate that. Now, it's one thing to be on a different side of the aisle, ideologically, politically, but we're just talking about reality. And reality is that Strom Thurmond came from that same state. The reality is that the Civil War started in that state. And so for you to just downplay all of that and then talk about how you've been racially profiled, how you feel like as an African American there are issues, but then to say that America is not racist. I think he could have been better served to say there are systems of oppression that still have their roots in America that need to be addressed, but I don't believe the American people as a whole are racist. That's a better way of walking the line. But, you know, myself as an African-American man who has experienced racism on all levels, this country has a race issue that needs to be addressed. We have not completed that. So saying that we had an African-American president for 8 years, saying that we have an African-American vice president does not solve the problem for millions of African Americans.
No, absolutely. And I think at minimum what he could have said is what I think he meant, which is that absolutely, there's far too much racism currently, forget historically, absolutely, but even currently. But what he probably, I think, really believes is that I believe these things can be overcome. That's what I think he really thinks. And not everyone feels that way. For a lot of people, there's a need for an entirely new constitution, an entirely new a redrawing of the entire portrait. And I don't think he feels that way. I think that they tend to be conservatives, especially at that level, tend to be incrementalists. So that's what I think he could have said, and that would have been a lot more honest to me.
Well, I guess my question is, with Kamala's her comment, should we be concerned about agendas if both of them kind of feel that way, that America's not racist and we kind of it has racist tendencies? Should we be concerned now about what gets pushed as agenda-wise between the two? Well, definitely Kamala, she's VP. Should we be concerned about that?
Well, I mean, that's why we have to hold people accountable, and I think that people need to understand that they just represent us. They don't speak for us. They represent us, and so we have to re-educate them on what's actually happening on the ground. So as much as I respect Vice President Harris, I disagree with her. I believe that this country has a serious race issue, racism. It has not gone anywhere. Just because some of us have achieved to the highest level does not mean that large amounts of us are still subject to traffic stops, are still subject to being shot and killed by the police, are still subject to racial discrimination. I mean, if we didn't have a race problem in America, why do we have the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice? These are just simple things that show that there is a systematic issue of race in this country that needs to be addressed. Now, do I believe in this generation that we can address it? Yes. We need to address it once and for all. We cannot just say, oh, that was a far gone era where, you know, racism existed. I mean, Ruby Bridges is literally 66 years old, and she desegregated elementary schools in the South. She's 66. So the people that were yelling at Ruby Bridges are still alive. Literally. So I think that when we get in that political rhetoric speak that we're trying to thread the needle, we just went through 4 years that showed us we don't need to thread any needles. They're not good people on both sides.
No.
Okay? When you storm the Capitol and try to overthrow the government with a flag of insurrection, they're not good people on both sides. So we need to address this issue once and for all in American society, and then we can move forward. But making statements on mass platforms that are wholly inconsistent with today's picture and yesterday's picture are not good for anybody. Now, do I believe we can work across the aisle on common themes? Yes, but we have to come from a common set of facts. There's no longer alternative facts. Those were called lies. Let's just call them what they were. They were lies. Yes. And so we cannot start from a basis of alternative facts. The Confederacy lost. That war does not need to be relitigated. We see what's happening with the alt-right and certain elements in the conservative movement. That needs to be addressed. And then we need to move forward as Americans on how we make America great for the first time for everyone.
Oh, agreed. I'd like to know kind of, and not to get too far out of the federal issues, but the insurrection was very, very, that was just yesterday as well.
Mm-hmm. Literally.
And I remember, and I remember us talking a lot about, at least when I was growing up, there was such a broad brush painted on behalf of J. Edgar Hoover and a million other people as well. And I think it just became a part of the American consciousness, how to classify organizations like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense as terrorists. And I mean, the amount of research and time and effort and money that went into cracking down on these different groups that were termed militant groups. And I want to know what you think kind of about what the administration and what I was hoping to hear kind of personally out of the Biden administration was their plan for this domestic terrorism, which sounds like everything, which just sounds like white terrorism, basically. Because I don't hear it. I don't understand it any other way. They didn't refer to any other form of terrorism that way. There was Islamic radicals. Now it's domestic terrorism. So if it's white terrorism or white national terrorism or
supremacy,
or neo-Nazism, then I really wanted to hear kind of what their plan is for addressing that, because apparently it is a huge problem. And it continues to be incident after incident after incident and place after place after place. And I appreciate the Stop Asian Hate movement, but stopping the hate isn't really naming the perp. Does that make sense? It's like it's not putting a big. I'm not saying the light cast on that.
I think that's the issue we talked about previously. It's like we gotta. This lumping they tend to do. They like to lump things together. Oh, well, we should stop all hate. No. If we're saying stop, black hate or Asian hate, we need to address each one. And we seem to always get overlooked when stuff gets addressed directly.
Yes, and the 14 incidents that they were addressing with this as well, 13 of those individuals, of the people who committed the acts of violence were white people and were white men. So they were not black people. They were not brown people. So what we're really talking about is stopping white on Asian hate. And I think that they could just underline it that way. I think that would be helpful.
Oh, no, because if they did that, then you have to start being very insistent and intentional when you address all these things. They're not going to do that. This is like when we talk about they use the term diversity. Well, now diversity is not just, minority is not just black folks. It used to be just black folks. You said minorities, you were talking about black folks. No. When you say minority, you're talking about women, you're talking about LGBT. They like to lump stuff together, and I feel like we always get overlooked when it happens. And we were talking about this before the show starts. 8 Asian people got killed. It's a terrible ordeal, but immediately legislation is on somebody's desk and it's getting signed. LGBTQ make a lot of noise. I appreciate them. It's all good. Immediately stuff comes down the pipeline. We've been fighting these things for decades, and it's always a struggle to get anything to come down the pipeline and get signed. It comes down the pipeline, but it never gets signed. Why do we keep going back to square one? That's the part I'm trying to figure out.
And you're the perfect guest for this question because of the Atlanta NAACP and your leadership there. So maybe you could also kind of shed a light on that, on what it means, who the advancement of color people is for. And is there sort of this, because what I don't like is this sort of what begins to feel like the misery Olympics or the racism Olympics.
Who's got it worse?
Competing for who has it worse. I don't like that. I don't think that's helpful to anybody but white people. So please.
And also, what's on the agenda? Like, what is on the NAACP's agenda so that we kind of would know? Because I'm curious.
Well, I mean, clearly we've been fighting white supremacy, and we continue to fight white supremacy. We've been doing it for over 100 years. So it's different elements of fighting white supremacy. But I think we have to name it directly, and that's fighting white supremacy. I appreciate a lot of the organizing that's going around stopping Asian hate. Many African Americans were behind that in solidarity with our Asian brothers and sisters. Of course, LGBTQIA, mainly the organizers behind that movement were black individuals who were leading that movement. And so I think that we just have to name it. We have to have ownership that there is a systemic issue of white supremacy in this country that needs to be addressed. No longer will you be able to just lump people together. And when we talk about the NAACP, it's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, particularly African Americans. Of course, we had 2 major founders who were African American, of course, W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, who wrote extensively on lynchings. We're still seeing extrajudicial killings, which are exactly what lynchings are. So the NAACP's agenda is to push forward and fight against white supremacy, fight against racial discrimination. Those are our pillars. To focus on education, civil rights, and to focus on the advancement of those individuals, primarily African Americans. particularly at the Atlanta NAACP, we've been fighting a massive push against the Confederacy. Now, when we first started that, people were kind of confused as to why the Atlanta NAACP would focus on battling a battle that's been going on for 150 years. But if you understand that you have to deal with the root of the problem as well as the vines and the branches. The root of the problem is the belief that a certain group of people are superior. And we believe in equity and equality, so we had to fight it there. And of course, it morphed. Once you saw what happened in Charlottesville, it became quite clear why we were fighting those symbols. Those symbols reinforce the belief that a certain group of people are superior. So it goes into racial discrimination. It goes into police brutality. It goes into all forms of hate. And so that's what we've been focused on. Of course, we've been focused on police brutality, whether that's Jimmy Atchison's case, whether that's Oscar Kane, Kane Rogers, Rayshard Brooks, and all of the other cases. But that's what we've been mainly focused on. And what do we need to do to push forward our agenda? Hold elected officials accountable, regardless if they are a D or an R, because we don't have any permanent enemies or permanent allies. We have permanent issues that we are trying to make not
really
permanent.
Really well put.
Okay, so what we're working on, again, we mobilized the vote, but we told people when they went out to vote that we weren't just going to tell them go vote and then go home. No, we want you to go vote and then get active and find out if the people keep their campaign promises that they deliver for the people that elected them. Let's be clear. South Carolina and Georgia delivered this administration. And then Georgia delivered the Senate. So when we look at the past 100 days, we are appreciative of the American Rescue Act that dealt with COVID. We are appreciative of the one executive order that sort of had a conversation about systemic racism and certain kind of fluffy words. But we need the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And we need it right now. And so our demand for our new president and our warning to the new president is we held the last president accountable. We will do the exact same thing. So if it's not passed in the next, you said we'll give you your deadline. If it's not passed by the anniversary of the killing of George Floyd, it's going to be Freedom Summer all over again. And so what I need for the president to understand is you have executive order power. You signed 60 of them. Where's the executive order? And this is low-hanging fruit. Where's the executive order empowering the Obama 21st Century Policing Initiative's Task Force 94 recommendations? You could do that tomorrow. You could have done that in Georgia. You could empower the Department of Justice, which we appreciate that you have done somewhat under Merrick Garland, to start investigating these incidents of racial intolerance and police brutality. Not just George Floyd, not just Breonna Taylor, not just Ahmaud, but all of the cases. There are 97 cases in Fulton County alone. 97.
Seriously?
Yes. So we have a systemic issue of police violence in Georgia, in Fulton County, that we need the Department of Justice to open active investigation. Those are some of the things that the president can do right now. And so what we need to remember is this. Just like when we were holding Donald Trump and Mike Pence accountable every single time they came to Atlanta, we were outside trying to have a conversation. We can do the same thing with Joe Biden. I don't want to have to do that. I don't want to have to hold Kamala Harris accountable. But if we keep getting statements that are not reflective of what's actually happening on the ground. After the George Floyd verdict, there were 6 police killings within 24 hours. If that does not show that there is a systemic issue that needs to be addressed, I don't know what more is. And simply saying that we need to wait on the Congress, we're not doing that. You need to suspend the filibuster rule. You said the filibuster was a reflection of Jim Crow. Right? It was an artifact left over from Jim Crow. Okay, well, suspend it then. And let's get to a simple majority. Let's get these things passed. If there's a senator from West Virginia who thinks that it's better to play nice with some of the people who led the insurrection, maybe we need to primary that individual. We need to understand that politics should work for the people, and for the people that are not representative of the people, they need to be removed. They need to be voted out. And Anybody else who assumes that position needs to be held accountable. I think that's the new conversation in politics. You know, the difference between politics and law is based on facts and reason. Politics is based on opinion. We need more facts and reason driving our conversations. We can agree on facts and reason. We can't agree on opinion. It's not just my opinion that there are serious issues with racial violence in America. That's a fact. We cut on the news every single night and see that. And let's stop with the deflection of, well, what about black on black crime? Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's
Well, I don't wanna
okay.
hear that at all. Yeah.
Okay. FBI statistics. There were 14,000 homicides in 2019. 14,000 in a country of 330 million. Okay? Let's put that in perspective. 14,000, 330 million. So my question to the media is, if there were 14,000 killings in 2019, they're saying right now we're on track for 2020 during COVID, where the court system is shut down, to be between 16,000 to 20,000 in a country of 330 million. Where are you finding all of these killings that you play on the news over and over again? Or are you feeding into fear? Right. Let's get out of fear and let's get into facts. Do certain metropolitan areas have an issue? Yes, we can address those. But simply going back to the war on drugs and the war on crime that didn't work, will not work. You cannot incarcerate your way out of this. You need to shift your resources and to reimagine how we deal with public safety and how we reinvest in communities that give the individuals that are in this particular system an opportunity to find something new. That's the conversation that needs to be had, not the conversation about what about Chicago.
Yeah, no.
Look, let's be real.
And it's also facts that most people are always killed by their own race. That's
I understand
just white
that
people,
too.
brown people, black people.
But here's the problem: who was from Chicago? Al Capone. Was there not a problem with violence in Al Capone's time?
Literally.
We weren't talking about what about black on black crime then. So let's talk about facts. When you show me a real spike in crime, I mean a real one, that's not associated with one of the co-equal branches of government being shut down for a year. There has not been a trial in Georgia in over a year, which means that the people who are alleged, because again, when you're arrested by the police, you're alleged to have committed a crime. You haven't been convicted of anything. So everybody's innocent when they're arrested by the police. It's not to a jury of 12 decide that somebody has been convicted that they're a criminal. So if we shut down one of the co-equal branches of government, what do you think is going to happen? Well, people are going to get a little unruly. People are going to not have consequences for some of their actions. That's what needs to be reported. Not the fact that, oh, there was a shooting over here and there was a shooting over there. We don't even know who shot him. How do we not know who shot him? Because we hadn't had a trial.
So let me ask you this, because it sounds like what you said kind of goes to the ideology of defunding the police. So is that kind of what you're saying, that reallocating resources and stuff to other routes for better results? Is that kind of what you're saying?
I'm not saying defund, because people get caught up in the messaging. I'm going into reimagining what public safety looks like, because I believe everybody wants safe communities. Well, safe communities means better education, better access to resources, better quality of life. These are conversations that we can all agree on. This is not a black versus blue. This is about justice and equity. And I think that's how you bring both sides together and say, okay, we can have a real conversation. Because everybody wants clean water. Everybody wants to be able to walk down their street and not be frisked by the police or be shot by an alleged attacker. These are realities of people's lives that we need to address. So I think once we have elected officials who get out of the rhetoric, who get out of the 19th century and even the 20th century and start having a real conversation with the community, you will see both sides start to come together. But we have to have a reality-based conversation, not based on fear.
So one of the things you brought up before we get further, because I think there's a lot more around policing we wanted to talk about, was the voting rights. Or was HR 1?
HR 1, HR 4.
Yeah, and in the state of Georgia, we were just listening for weeks to all of our different statewide officials upset about the Braves, about Coca-Cola, about Delta,
Some movies.
especially. I don't know how voting works in other countries, but I find it so strange in the first place, despite how frustrating all this is, period, and just the retaliation legislation. I still find it so strange that something like voting, which you have to be a U.S. citizen to do, is not a federal task anyway. Like as much local control is wonderful in so many other areas, I really don't get why voting is a statewide thing. Anyway, if I travel to Oregon or to New York or to Florida, why should voting be different? I understand that there's statewide officials I'm voting for, but why is the process so different across the country when we're transient people? We don't.
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and that kind of goes to the conversation that needs to be had with one side of the aisle. On one hand, you're for limited government and local control, but when we're trying to streamline the process to protect everybody's voting rights, you don't want big government in your voting. So I'm confused. And let's talk about these statewide officials. Where was all of this energy and anger and frustration when the activists and the people were trying to talk to you guys before you signed the bill? Because here's the thing, and I love the governor's talking points, but Governor, we read House Bill 531. We read Senate Bill 241. We were outside for 30 days trying to have a conversation. The pastors tried to have a conversation with Lieutenant Governor Duncan and the governor before you signed the bill. So we knew what was happening before it happened. It wasn't until we used the courageous blueprints of our ancestors to get your attention that you started talking. And let's be real. You need to read all 98 pages of Senate Bill 202, because if this is truly about voter access and this expands access to the ballot, why are you taking away mobile voting units?
Right.
Why are you changing the times and the places for absentee ballots, moving the drop boxes inside between 9 to 5? Why is there a local takeover, a state takeover of local boards of election if this is really about voter access? Governor Kemp, with all due respect, stop with the talking points and read the bill. I would even say just read from page 3 to page 7, which is a summary of what this bill does. It criminalizes line warming. This is not ballot electioneering or trying to take somebody and convince them to vote a certain way. That's always been illegal in Georgia. It's always been illegal to campaign within 150 feet of a poll. These were people that were simply trying to give water to people that are being suppressed because the maintenance of elections in certain counties are different than other counties. So you may have in Fulton County, we got 800,000 registered voters. You need more machines than you would need in Lowndes County. So when you start trying to manipulate the words on certain networks, you need to understand that people were outside trying to have a conversation with you for the extent of the period of the legislature. All 40 days they were trying to have a conversation, and we know what the actual bill changed from. You were trying to get rid of all no excuse absentee balloting. If it wasn't for the protests, you would have done that. And then what would have been the excuse when we were trying to expand voting rights? And here's the problem. Again, we talk about opinion as opposed to facts and evidence. Where's the evidence of massive, widespread voter fraud? Show me a court case that proves any of that. Show me your Secretary of State, who now you're investigating. You just appointed a special counsel to defend, who said we had the gold standard. Why are we doing these things if voter fraud didn't exist in this previous election? And you know how we know voter fraud didn't exist? Because the state capitol didn't switch. If people were actually out there committing voter fraud, that was the dumbest voter fraud ever, because they reelected almost a supermajority. So I think we need to start from a starting point of actually reading the bill, all 98 pages, or if you don't want to read the 98 pages, read from page 3 to page 7, which is a summary that outlines everything that's in the bill. There are some serious concerns in the bill, and having a real conversation, because we can still fix this. And we talk about economic withdrawals and economic disruptions. That's how you get people's attention. You know, you didn't start talking until people threatened to boycott the Coke, threatened a boycott that's actually happening right now to Home Depot, threatened to boycott the Delta, and we was actually out at the airport protesting Delta when you arrested Park Cannon. So we got to start from a place of actual facts and reading the law and making sure we understand the law. And do you know how I know this is about voter suppression? Why do we not have a chairman of the state board of elections because of this bill? If it's truly about transparency and voter access, why was the Secretary of State, who is a Republican, removed?
I just feel like if I was a sitting Republican in this state, I would be so pissed off that I have to spend the last year of my term fighting the battles for somebody who lost their seat when I didn't lose my seat. Like, this all came from somebody who was not reelected. Everyone else was reelected. All the people sitting under that gold dome were reelected. And that would not be what I would want to spend my time doing. And the angry base that can't get over it will just kind of have to, or they can vote for Democrats.
Well, I mean, it shows the infighting in all these parties. The infighting in the Republican Party, those who are progressive, those who are still angry.
I just would
all
not
this
carry
infighting
on this
is just,
campaign on Trump's behalf.
I mean, I guess my thing is we want to. It's kind of it literally feels like a nightmare that we just woke up from the last 4 years, and that's cool. But I feel like we can't forget what we were shown in those last 4 years. We were shown those last 4 years that all these races that we thought were dead or gone, they're still here, and they've been in hiding in all these systems and the way we operate. And they put all these safeguards up. We can't forget those lessons. So I feel like the blatancy of what they just did in Georgia it's absolutely disgusting. But it's a good segue for those that did not understand what happened with Representative Park Cannon. Can you explain what all happened and what that was about?
So again, protesters were out at the state capitol for 30 days. On the 27th day, after the bill passed the House and went over to the Senate and passed the Senate, passed the House, it was immediately transmitted to the Senate, which was irregular. So state representatives and clergy all went down to the Capitol to try to have a conversation, to try to have that meeting where we could come to a meeting of the minds of what would actually protect Georgia voters, but also deal with integrity of the vote. Nobody wanted to have a meeting except for Jeff Duncan. I give him credit. He met with the pastors. He met with some of the activists. So after that meeting, all of a sudden it passed the Senate and was immediately transmitted to the governor's desk for signature. Now, many of the activists had gone out to the airport. They were protesting, talking about the boycott that was coming for Delta. When we heard that there was going to be a signing, got a phone call. 5 of the activists and 2 state reps were down at the state. And, of course, most of your bill signings are done in public. This bill signing was done behind closed doors in a special office in the governor's office. So my client, State Representative Park Cannon, who is the secretary of the Georgia House Democratic Caucus, whose job it is to witness the signing of bills, wanted to witness the signing of this bill. So she knocked on the governor's front office, didn't get a response, walked around, knocked on the governor's special ceremony office, and that's when the video started. She was told to step back. She asked the question, why are you preventing me from witnessing the signing of the bills? This is my job. Police officer really didn't have anything to say at that point. He leans up against the wall there. Next thing you know, she knocks again. He arrests her, drags her through the Capitol. You hear the activists and Erica Thomas, who was there, talking to the police officer. Why are you doing this? She's simply doing her job. She's being dragged all through the Capitol. It was something reminiscent of the 60s and the 50s. Literally thrown in the back of a car. I get the phone call as I'm driving back from the airport because I'm hearing that he's going to sign the bill. I know he signed the bill. I'm driving back. I'm coming to the Capitol to see this. Next thing I know, you need to go to Rice Street. She's being taken to Rice Street. So we go to Rice Street. Many of the activists are there. Her family's there. At some point, Reverend Warnock gets there. We get her out of jail. And it's just reminiscent of the level of vitriol that these people have for black folks exercising their constitutional rights. This is still Georgia. This is still the birthplace of the civil rights movement. Dr. King is actually prominently placed 2 places at the Capitol. John Lewis laid in state in the rotunda, and the governor gave a speech over his body. But yet he's in the special ceremony room signing a bill under a plantation.
Literally, because that came up.
Yeah. And so we get her out, had conversations with the district attorney about the case. District attorney said publicly she didn't charge anybody in this. It was the Capitol Police that charged her. And, you know, we're gathering the evidence, getting the witnesses who were all there, who were all video recording. And then we see the police report. And I must say, you know, I've been handling cases a long time. You know, I try to give the police the benefit of the doubt. But this police report was wholly devoid of real facts. Namely, nobody kicked or pushed anybody.
That was in the report?
Oh, yeah. Said she stomped on his foot and kicked him. And it made him, before that, think back to the Capitol insurrection. What the protesters were doing inside of the Georgia State Capitol made him remember the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol.
Who was him?
One of the police officers.
Is that PTSD?
I don't know. But my thing was, it was disgusting to even think that you would think back to that incident in American history when you have African-American, female, and other female activists who are simply requesting to witness the signing of the most regressive election law in a generation.
And this is not a random. My thing is, this is not a random person. Like, she's not a random person that just showed up and started knocking on doors. Like,
but here's the main problem. She, under the Georgia Constitution, is free from arrest while they're in session. That's in the Georgia Constitution. So for all of these people that run around here and beat their chests saying they're about law and order and they're constitutionalists, have you read the Constitution? Both the United States and the Georgia Constitution. You would know you could not arrest her except for 3 instances. One would be treason. Well, clearly she wasn't doing anything treasonous. 2 would be a breach of the peace. Where was the breach of the peace? And 3 would be a felony. What felony was happening? There was no felony.
Is that why she was charged with a felony? Because I was sitting back.
That's exactly why she was charged with a felony, and it was ludicrous, the felony that she was charged with. She was charged with obstruction, offering to do violence to the law enforcement officer. Well, we all saw the video. We literally saw the video, and we had 5 witnesses. So the good thing about what happened with Park is she had witnesses, and now the country got a chance to see the difference between a police report that's one-sided narrative of law enforcement as opposed to the facts. And that's why it's important to know that a person's not a criminal until they're convicted by a jury that's heard all of the facts. So I'm happy that the district attorney investigated, listened to our witnesses, watched the video, and ultimately dismissed this case in 12 days. But it underscores that there's a real conversation happening around the country that is devoid of facts and evidence and is not reflective of what the law actually says.
Thank you for breaking that down too, because even when we watched it, my first thought was, what possible felony? I was like, worst case scenario is trespassing. That's a misdemeanor.
Which is a misdemeanor.
And even then it's not, but a felony, I just could not understand for the life of me. And now this makes perfect sense. So that just also goes to show that a police report, valid or invalid, false or not, is enough to indict someone with outside of that situation. And do you want to ask more about Park County? Because I wanted to ask about Benson Truitt.
Well, no, I guess my takeaway from it was like, well, Dak, even as a legislator or in that capacity, you're still not even protected as an African American. They dragged her away like she was some common person who just showed up and started knocking on doors. And I'm just like, I know you know who she is. You see her all the time.
And this wasn't the first time that the Capitol Police have done something like that to an African American female legislator.
Seriously?
We have to remember what happened in Nikema Williams at another protest. And here's the thing: people need to understand the Capitol belongs to the people.
Literally.
The most sacred part of the Capitol is the rotunda. The actual purpose of the rotunda is free speech. So to be present in the rotunda and to be silenced is the worst form of political silencing that we can have in our democracy. And that's why it's important for people to understand why people are protesting. They're not out there just for their health. They're not out there just to get some attention. They're out there to defend our democracy. Unlike the people who tried to overthrow the government at the U.S. Capitol with weapons and beating law enforcement officers and carrying an insurrectionist flag And so for that officer to say this reminded him of the insurrection, it's just so divorced of facts.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's important for us to continue to have this political conversation that can pull this country back together. But we have to do it based on facts and evidence and not opinion.
It's also disturbing just as a citizen to imagine that an officer is going to handle you in a way based on the fact that he's being reminded of something else. Like to be anywhere but here and to be present. Like that to me just sounds like you can't take the worst possible scenario you can imagine, whether it happened on TV, miles and miles away, or last night to you in person. You can't take that into your next interaction. You can't treat that person like the last
That's
person you
garbage. I'm not
interacted
even
with.
buying that. That's just garbage. They just did that to put up a report. That's foolishness. I'm not even going to entertain that. But go ahead and ask about the Vincent.
Yeah, so this is the case that the Cobb County case that we wanted to talk about. And I don't know how much you can share about the Vincent Truitt case. But the last time that we, I think, discussed it on the show was because there was a press conference that the Cobb DA held, that Flynn Brody held, in which he was discussing what his process was. And I think he had some of the other folks in the office. I think he had an investigator to discuss as well. But we know that you're handling that case. I had a question kind of about one of his comments about the grand jury. And what he told reporters was that he presented them with what he had, with certain pieces of information, and then he let them kind of decide. And I thought that was so strange. I'd never heard of a DA articulating it that way. I always heard that there was a specific charge presented, or maybe one or two or three. And I know the grand jury can no bill or can true bill, but I still didn't understand the idea that it was just an open book. Is that common? Is that more common than we know?
And before you answer, for those that don't remember what happened or know what happened, explain what happened in that case.
Okay, July the 13th, 2020, a young man, 17 years old, was in a stolen vehicle, a vehicle that was reported stolen. He was the passenger. Cobb County Police made contact with this vehicle who one of the defendants was driving. That defendant led the police on a high-speed chase, which really was a low-speed chase, down Six Flags Parkway, through the Quick Trip, back around past the epicenter, and then behind the warehouse, at which point the driver got out of the vehicle and took off running. Vincent Truitt, the passenger in the vehicle, after he had been pit maneuvered, climbed over the driver's seat and came out that seat and took about 3 steps and was shot in his back twice by a Cobb County police officer. This case received national attention because they would not release the body cam and the dash cam video. Previous District Attorney Joyette Holmes met with the family a couple times, showed them the video, and then subsequently she lost her election to Flynn Brody, who inherited the case and ultimately made a decision to present it to a civil grand jury. And the reason why I say it's a civil grand jury is because the grand jury was never presented charges upon which to determine whether or not there was probable cause to indict the officer. Now, there is some discrepancy between my legal analysis and his legal analysis of what type of grand jury he presented this to. But we know that it was not a criminal grand jury, because criminal grand juries get a list of proposed charges and have to either no bill or true bill. This grand jury recommended no further action. They were never presented with charges. They also, another reason why we know it's not a criminal grand jury, in Georgia, an officer who is the target of an investigation has an absolute right to appear before any criminal grand jury to give testimony and to be cross-examined. That officer was never present. So what the district attorney did was present the GBI agent who investigated the case and allowed the grand jurors to ask questions and to watch some of, or not all, the video footage, and then make a determination on whether to recommend that further action be taken. At that point, Mr. Brody would have then presented it to a grand jury with charges. This is highly irregular. In the 59 counties in Georgia, there are only 2 or 3 counties that handle it this way. It's not the appropriate way to handle it. What should have happened was he should have presented charges and all of the evidence, including the officer's testimony. And now that we have all this testimony, I fully believe that they would have returned an indictment for this officer. And so what we're calling for now is for an independent investigation by the Department of Justice into this case, as well as an independent investigation by the Attorney General of this state, because after we saw what we saw in George Floyd, with that Attorney General having to step in against the wishes of the Hennepin County District Attorney, you saw them indict the police officer and convict the police officer. What we have in a lot of these cases, just like what we saw in Breonna Taylor, is a prosecutor who's not willing to simply follow the actual law. The law on grand juries in criminal matters is quite clear. Now, I understand he's arguing a subsection of a different law, which arguably maybe he might be able to pull a fast one on the public. But for people that are used to doing this, we understand that's a civil grand jury. The family never asked you to present it to a civil grand jury. You're trying to pass the buck because it's a difficult case. And the purpose of the prosecutor is not to be the defense attorney for the police. The purpose of the prosecutor is to seek justice for the people of Cobb County. And the people of Cobb County are split on what happened to Vincent DeMario Truitt. And Georgia law is quite clear on when a police officer can use deadly force. It's when that person is an imminent threat of serious bodily harm or death to the police officer. The thing about it is, I don't believe that the grand jury, the civil one, heard the statements of the police officer in question. And that statement contradicted what Flynn Brody told the press that evening. Flynn Brody said that Vincent Truitt was a threat to the officer and the officers in front of that officer who were chasing the other suspect that went around the air conditioner unit. But the officer told the GBI that all of the other officers were behind him and that he never saw the muzzle of the gun that Vincent allegedly had, which means that he was behind Vincent. Vincent posed no threat, and he shot him in the back twice. It's very difficult to justify shooting somebody in the back that's running away from you. I would argue it's illegal, and it needs to be presented to a criminal grand jury for indictment, and then ultimately we can determine whether or not this was a justifiable shooting the way we should, and that's in front of a jury of 12.
Yeah, the small amount of footage he did show, you couldn't see any other officers. You couldn't see them. It was like a broad, widescreen lens, but there was only Vincent in the frame. There was no other human that you could see in the frame. But so that makes sense. That verifies what I was thinking, which is that I've never heard of anything like this happening before, because I've never served on the grand jury, but I've served on the trial jury, and I was thinking, I can't imagine sitting back and having to decide what to charge someone with when this book is like,
yeah,
the
like
criminal code
what's
alone
next?
is like
what are we supposed to do
over
next?
100 pages long. So,
but that's the thing we were discussing about Flynn and Fonnie with these high profile cases kind of not following typical protocols. Like, is that something that we should be concerned about? Which I guess brings me to my next point. We talk about handling all these things, and we're talking about specifically in Georgia. How much help is our administration here? Having Keisha Lance Bottoms, having Flynn, how much help are they? Are they really like doing what should be expected of them in the capacity of their power, or should we be? Because we talked about this before we got on air, so I want your honest opinion on that. Like, are they really helping, or are they really making things a little more difficult?
Well, the short answer is no. Flynn Brody was in direct contact with this family prior to him being elected. He came to protest. He was in communication with the family. He made certain promises. After he got elected, he continued to be in contact with my office, but we believe that certain promises that were made were not kept. With regard to Mayor Bottoms, she has multiple cases that have happened in the city of Atlanta that have not been addressed. There are 97 open cases in Fulton County, many of which are from Atlanta police officers who are still working for the Atlanta Police Department. We've had multiple conversations with the previous chief, Erica Shields, before she went to Louisville. We were trying to work out these issues, but the short answer is there are civil rights cases that the city of Atlanta has yet to settle because of actions of their own police department, and that squarely falls on the shoulders of the mayor. It's disheartening to see the mayor issue statements about things that are happening in Minnesota when she has the same issues happening in her own police department. Namely, you release a statement about George Floyd, but you got Oscar Kane, Jimmy Atchison, and others, Deatrick Griffin, that happened on your watch. And then you have other cases that preceded your watch that put you on notice that there's an issue within the Atlanta Police Department. Rayshard Brooks was the tip of the iceberg, but he was not a one-off. And so when you have elected leadership that are not addressing these issues, it's a problem. And I think, you know, as African Americans, we have to be intellectually honest. If we're going to hold other parties accountable, we have to hold our own party accountable. You know, and so, you know, from the position I sit, you know, as a civil rights attorney, as well as an activist, I can't pretend like Atlanta doesn't have a police brutality problem. I would argue Atlanta has the worst police brutality problem because we cover it up. We don't investigate these things. We don't make these families whole. And then we go on TV and pretend like it's not happening. And so I just think that in this next mayoral election, you know, regardless of who's running, we need to make this a central issue. This is the birthplace of civil rights. Dr. King's speech to Washington, he talked about the evils of police brutality. Representative John Lewis talked about the evils of police brutality. But in the city that was home to both of them, the birthplace of one of them, we're not addressing these issues. And we have to address these issues in a way that speaks to the humanity of the families. We can also support good officers, good law enforcement officers. This is not about...
Because I was going to ask, how do you address the resignations that they keep bringing up? And that I know you hear that argument all the time, is that, you know, well, we're at this point, we're so desperate for officers that how can we possibly find good ones if we don't have good ones? Or how can we encourage them to be better if they feel that they are constantly, that their actions are scrutinized to the point where they can't make decisions that are in their own best interest?
Well, I mean, doctors' actions are scrutinized. Lawyers' actions are scrutinized. Everybody's actions are scrutinized. Why are they any different? And my argument would be, if people are leaving the profession because they're afraid of accountability, maybe they shouldn't have been in that profession. And so what I say to the good officers, and there are lots of them, many of them pull me to the side and say, keep doing what you're doing, because it's making it easier for us to tell. We have to dispel the blue wall of silence. That's why I give credit in Minnesota for the police chief testifying and for all of the trainers to testify that none of this was a part of his training or standard operating procedure. We need that across the board. If they really want to have a conversation with the community on how we rebuild trust, you got to deal with accountability. You got to have a conversation with the police unions to say, listen, we got to get rid of sovereign immunity and qualified immunity so we can hold the officers accountable. And you know, to the recommendations of Tim Scott, I need for him to actually have tried some of these cases to realize that if you just say we're going to deal with qualified immunity with the police department is going to say, yeah, well, we didn't teach him to do that. So we are not liable because we didn't teach him to do that. We have to make sure we hold the officer accountable to his actions.
Right.
And so that's the solution. And I think that in Atlanta, if we're being real about this, we have politicians in that peculiar position to make change. The question is, why are they not making the change?
Any thoughts on why they're not making a change?
Well, I mean, you know, you can't be in the middle on this. You either about justice and equity or you about stalling. I mean, think about it. If you really do support the police, would it be best to support the good officers and hold the bad officers accountable? Because if you get rid of the bad officers, you have more what? Resources that you can reinvest in the good officers. So my question is, you know, this has been going on in Atlanta since Katherine Johnston. Why has nothing changed? Why are we still protecting officers that violate the public trust? And I'm not talking about one or two instances. There are officers out there with 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 instances. There are officers with lengthy histories, just like the officer in Cobb County. And so, you know, we need to stop putting up that blue wall of silence that sometimes seeps into the DA's office. And we need to make the standard operating procedure that if you witness a crime, period, point blank, full stop, whether that's a citizen or a police officer, you have an affirmative duty to report that. And if you don't report it, you'll be held accountable. And then we'll really get to see where these good officers really are.
All right, so we're down to our last couple of minutes. So we like to come up with solutions.
Yes.
So what should we be focused on? What should be the agenda for us at this point? What should we be focused on? What should we be rallying behind to make happen?
Two things. We have to deal with the issue of voter suppression, and we have to deal with the issue of police brutality, because they go hand in hand. So we need to make sure our elected officials on the local, the county, and the state and the federal level are focused on those two things. Because if they take away your right to vote, they now have the right to kill you and justify it. Because they're going to say, well, you know, they were doing this and they were doing that, and now they can't vote, so they have no voice, so we can exclude them from the jury pool, and they can't be a part of the process of determining what actually happened. So we got to make sure we defend that. We have to be on the defense for those two issues. But we also have to be on the offense to make sure we hold our elected officials accountable. That means, what's going on with our education? Why are we not investing in that? Affordable housing, seriously, why are we redeveloping the Gulch and calling it a new name when we don't really have affordable housing that's actually being built? Kudos for breaking ground in the 4th year of your administration.
Literally.
But what happened to the promises of affordable housing in year 1, year 2, and year 3? Atlanta is at a affordability crisis.
Literally.
We need to be on the offense. We need to also deal with wage inequality. So many people can't make ends meet because they don't have a livable wage. This is low-hanging fruit. This is the kind of stuff that will motivate large amounts of people to go out and vote and to make sure that they participate in the electoral process. Let's talk about health care. I mean, why is health care not a human right? Why is it not a civil right? You know, we need to finish the work of the leaders that came before us so we don't have to pass it to the ones that are coming after us. This needs to be the last generation that we deal with these issues. And the main issue that we have to deal with that sums up all of this is racism. Let's just get real. It's real. I'm 42 years old. I've dealt with racism my entire life. I'm an African-American man who's an attorney who gets afraid when the blue lights come on behind me because I don't know what is the proper way to respond. I know what the law says. I know what Terry versus Ohio says. I know what Van Zant versus the state, which is Georgia's seminal Supreme Court case on traffic stops and police encounters. But that, you know, when you look at these body cams and you look at what's happening, none of that matters. You know, people are always saying, why don't you just obey the police, be compliant? First off, the Constitution says you don't have to do that. The only thing you have to do is show them your ID. Everything else is in your discretion and it becomes a consensual search. You do not have to obey the police. That is not the law. The law is that you protect your civil rights. You have a 4th Amendment right against unlawful searches and seizures. You have a 5th Amendment right against making any statements that can be used against you. So let's stop with all that propaganda. Let's get it back into the hands of the people, because law enforcement is there to enforce the law. They are not the law. The law is the determination of the legislature and the interpretation of the judiciary. Period. Full stop. And who are those branches accountable to? The people. You know, a lot of people run around here saying they're constitutionalists and they believe in the Constitution. You know, I was kind of torn when I first went to law school. You know, I believe that the Constitution at that point was a living document that evolved with time. And so I had an opportunity to ask some questions to the Honorable late Justice Anton Scalia about originalism. Because at that point, I didn't believe in originalism. And so, you know, he said, you know, his position, and I listened to it, and I disagreed with it, and he had some terse words to say to me. But as I practiced law in Georgia's longest trial and had some of the most high-profile cases in Georgia history, I think I'm starting to become an originalist. And I'll tell you why. Because if you believe the Constitution should be applied the way it's originally written, along with the amendments, then there's no exceptions to these unreasonable stops. There's none. There's no exceptions to the right to remain silent. There's none. There's no exceptions to the First Amendment right, which they're trying to abridge. And for my conservative brothers and sisters, there'd be no exception to the Second Amendment. So why are we carving out these exceptions? We're carving out these exceptions because we're trying to withhold a system that's actually evolving. More people are being included into the rights of basic citizens. A lot of people talk about the Constitution is outdated. Well, you know, the Constitution has a way of remedying that. We don't have to tear it up. We can amend it.
Right, amendment.
Amendments. If we believe that certain things should change over time, we can amend it. That's why I say it's not a living document, but it's an amendable document. And if you understand the process, then you can make the process work for you. But the way we have to make this process work is to deal with these politicians. And the politicians need to understand one thing. Money does not run politics. It helps you get elected. But if you actually speaking to the people, you don't need all that money. Think about it. The last 2 presidential elections, did the person who raised the most money win? No. Hillary raised a whole lot of money, and Donald Trump wiped the floor with her. Donald Trump raised a whole lot of money. They talked about his war chest. He had a war chest ready for all of them commercials that we didn't watch and all that stuff that was on YouTube. My daughter came to me and said, Daddy, are the Democrats really going to destroy the country? I'm like, where are you getting this from? YouTube. How did that work out for Donald?
Is it true?
But if you actually talk to the people, and the people were trying to talk to the 45th president, his whole presidency. They were on Twitter trying to talk to him. They were in his face trying to talk to him. They came to his house. That's why he had to build that fence around his house. He didn't want to talk to him. So they had a conversation with him in November. Then they said, well, that must have been voter fraud, wide-scale voter fraud. So then they had a conversation with him in January by flipping the Senate. Now we need to have a conversation with the Senate and the House and the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Do what you promised. Fulfill the needs to the people that you told you were going to fulfill these needs, and they'll reelect you. But if they don't, November can't come quick enough.
All right. Well, there you have it. Just as invigorating as I knew it was going to be. Special thanks to our special guest on today, Attorney Gerald Griggs.
Very special thanks.
I'm speechless. There definitely has to be a part 2 because there was still so much more we really could have gotten into. But we're out of time, unfortunately. So we will see you guys next Friday at 12, where our guest will be, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong. I know I'm going to. David Windicher will be with us on
David,
Friday.
good friend of mine, yeah.
I know. I
I
saw
know
that
you
y'all
know.
were thing. He will be with us on Friday, same time, same place, on the Leadership Blend Live podcast with your host, Ricardo D. Rice.
That was fun.
That was beautiful.